Every night it rises in the east as a red point of light, visible to the naked eye, hanging above the horizon like something that does not quite belong among the stars. Every culture in human history has named it. Every civilization has watched it. And for most of recorded history, no one could explain why it glowed red when everything else in the sky did not. Scientists now say the answer is iron oxide, rust. The surface of Mars is covered in rust, and that is why it burns red. That is the official answer. But the Book of Enoch, written over 2,000 years ago, banned by the Church, preserved in the mountains of Ethiopia, does not call it a planet. It does not describe a geological formation. It calls Mars by a name that translates from the ancient Ethiopic as the world that was judged. And what the text says happened there, and what it says escaped before the judgment fell, is not a story about geology. It is a story about what came before us and why it was destroyed. I'm Julian Crane, an archaeologist the establishment pushed out when I started asking the questions my colleagues wouldn't. So on this channel, I dig up the history they left out. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get into what the Book of Enoch says Mars actually is, and what once lived on it. The passage survives in two manuscript traditions that should not agree with each other as precisely as they do. The first is the Ethiopic text held at Axum, in the restricted archive that outside scholars have never been permitted to examine in full. Its section heading translates as the words concerning the Red World and those who departed from it. The second is a fragmentary Aramaic text from the Qumran Cave 4 collection, catalogued in the range scholars label 4Q Enoch, held at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. Those particular fragments are not on public display. What we know of their content comes largely from the research notes of Joseph Mielik, the Polish scholar who spent 2 decades cataloguing the Qumran material. Mielik referenced the Red World passage in his private correspondence, but left it out of his published 1976 volume on the Enoch fragments. Florentino Garcia Martinez, whose 1994 translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls is still the standard reference, noted the passage's existence in a 1998 academic paper and described it as requiring a cosmological framework that current scholarship is not prepared to supply. He did not elaborate. He has not returned to the subject in print. James Vandercombe of Notre Dame, co-author of the definitive scholarly introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls, has written that the Enoch manuscript tradition contains strata of material whose origin and intent remain genuinely unclear. That phrase, in academic writing, functions the way yellow police tape functions at a crime scene. It marks the boundary. It does not tell you what is inside. And George Nicholsberg, among the most authoritative Enoch scholars alive, has written that the cosmological passages, the sections dealing with other worlds and other places, are the most systematically avoided sections of the entire manuscript in Western scholarship. He calls the avoidance a pattern. Patterns have reasons, and a pattern that survives across generations of scholars usually has a reason nobody wants to write down. Now here is where it gets unsettling, because this is not reinterpretation. This is not a modern reader projecting modern knowledge backward onto ancient poetry. What the text says, it says plainly. It reads the way a witness statement reads, flat, sequential, specific, with no apparent awareness that what it is describing should be impossible. And when you set that description against what planetary scientists have confirmed about Mars in the last 40 years, it matches with a precision that a writer in the 3rd century before Christ should not possess. The text begins like this. The opening verses of the Red World passage describe a place the author calls the first Earth, a world that existed before this one, not in time, but in the order of creation. Enoch places it in the heavens, visible from Earth, moving in a fixed path among the stars. He describes its surface as covered in red dust, the color of dried blood. He says it has no rain. He says the air above it is thin as breath at the end of a long climb. And he says that beneath its surface, water hides in stone, not flowing, not drinkable, locked inside the rock. Now hold that against what we know. Mars has no rain. Its atmosphere is less than 1% as thick as Earth's. Its surface is iron oxide, red dust. And in 2018, the European Space Agency's radar instrument detected a body of liquid water beneath the Martian South Pole, buried under 1.5 miles of ice. The text describes all 4 of those things, in order, in a document over 2,000 years old. And look at how specific the last one is. Not water on the surface, not seas or rivers, water hidden in stone, not flowing, not drinkable, locked in the rock. That is not a lucky guess about a wet world. It is a precise description of a dry one that still holds water where you cannot reach it, which is exactly the Mars the radar found in 2018, and exactly the opposite of what a person inventing a paradise or a hell would ever think to write. But it does not stop at the surface. It describes the sky. Enoch says the red world has 2 lights that are not stars. They move too quickly to be stars, circling the world without rest, night after night. Mars has 2 moons, Phobos and Deimos. Both are small, both are fast. Phobos completes a full orbit of Mars in under 8 hours, so fast that from the Martian surface it rises in the west and sets in the east, moving visibly, measurably within a single night. No other moon in the solar system behaves this way. Enoch describes exactly this. He uses a word for their movement that elsewhere in the text describes a person walking, not a star drifting, something that moves the way a living thing moves, fast enough to watch. That is not a metaphor, it is an observation, and the only real question is how an observer in the 3rd century before Christ made it. Because you cannot see the moons of Mars from Earth with the naked eye. You cannot see them at all without a telescope. They were not discovered until 1877 by the American astronomer Asaph Hall, using one of the largest refracting telescopes in the world, and even then they were so faint and so close to the planet's glare that he nearly gave up the search. Phobos is about 14 miles across. Deimos is smaller still. From Earth they are 2 specks of reflected light, lost in the brightness of the planet beside them, invisible for the entire span of human history until the machinery of the 19th century finally caught them. And yet a text, written more than 2,000 years earlier, says the red world has 2 lights that are not stars, that move too fast to be stars, circling it without rest. 2, not 1, not 3, 2, moving fast, exactly as they do. And this is where it gets disturbing, because the text does not describe an empty world, it describes inhabitants. They are not named in the surviving Aramaic, but the Ethiopic gives them a collective designation. It calls them the first ones, or more precisely, those who came before the earth was prepared. And the description of their physical form is detailed in a way most Western translations abbreviate or cut. They are described as tall. The Ethiopic uses the same word it uses elsewhere for the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers. Their skin is described as the color of the world they walked on, red or reddish, and their eyes are described as pale, adapted to a light weaker than the sun's full strength. Mars receives roughly half the sunlight Earth does. An organism adapted to life on Mars, if such a thing existed, would be adapted to dimmer light. The text describes exactly that adaptation without appearing to understand it as an adaptation. It simply records what it saw. Then it goes further, into the surface itself. It describes a scar in the ground of the red world, a wound so vast that the text says it could be seen from the position of the stars. The Ethiopic phrase is the Great Tearing. Mars has a canyon system called the Valles Marineris. It is 4,000 miles long. It is as wide as the continental United States. It is 7 miles deep in places. It is the largest canyon in the solar system. The text calls it the Great Tearing, and says it was made not by water, but by a force moving through the ground from beneath, which is consistent with the volcanic and tectonic origin scientists have proposed for it. And the text treats it as significant. It notes that the first ones built near it. The Ethiopic says they built at the edge of the Great Tearing, where the stone shows what is below. What the text says happened to them is the part that ties everything together. The first ones, according to the passage, did not simply die out. They were judged. The Ethiopic uses the same word for divine judgment that appears in Enoch's account of the flood. The same mechanism, the same authority, the same finality. But where the flood left survivors, the judgment of the red world did not. And the passage describes that judgment not as fire and not as water, but as a stripping away, something taken from the world itself rather than added to it. The protective covering of the world was removed, the air thinned, the water retreated into stone. The surface was left exposed to a heat and a cold and a radiation that nothing living could survive. It describes a world made uninhabitable by the removal of its shelter. Now hold that against the science, because this is the part that should not be possible. Mars' global magnetic field collapsed roughly 4 billion years ago. NASA's MAVEN mission, which has been studying the Martian upper atmosphere since 2014, has confirmed that without a magnetic field, Mars had no protection from the solar wind, and that the solar wind systematically stripped its atmosphere away over hundreds of millions of years. First the thick air thinned, then the liquid water disappeared into rock and ice. Then the surface became what it is today, exposed, irradiated, red, silent. The text describes that exact sequence, the order of the loss, and calls it a judgment. The scientists call it magnetospheric collapse. The description is the same. And the text was written 2,000 years before magnetospheres were understood to exist. And the stripping is not finished. It is still happening, right now, and we can measure it. The MAVEN mission's principal investigator, Bruce Jakosky of the University of Colorado, published findings in Science magazine in 2015, confirming that Mars is still losing its atmosphere to the solar wind today, at a rate of roughly 100 grams every second. The protective covering is still being pulled away, grain by grain, by a force coming from above, exactly as the passage describes the judgment. Jakosky's paper puts it in terms of solar wind and magnetic field loss. Enoch puts it in terms of the divine removal of a world's shelter. Strip the vocabulary off both accounts and the physical process underneath is identical. One was written by a NASA physicist with a spacecraft in Martian orbit. The other was written by a man who, by every rule we think we understand, had no way of knowing the red light in the sky was a world at all, let alone a dying one. Here is what the translators left out. The passage does not say all of the first ones died. A portion of the text, preserved more fully in the Ethiopic than in the surviving Aramaic, describes a departure. Some of the first ones left before the judgment fell. They descended. And the Ethiopic word for that descent is the same word used elsewhere in Enoch for the Watcher's descent to earth in the time before the flood. The two events, the departure from the red world and the later descent of the Watchers to earth, use identical language. The text appears to treat them as the same kind of event, the same act, the same kind of being. It says they did not arrive on earth in a form its people recognized. They arrived changed by the journey, altered by the passage between worlds, in a way that made them appear as something neither fully divine nor fully physical. And the word the text uses for that altered state is the same word used elsewhere for the Watchers when they first appeared to Enoch. Beings of fire and form, present but not quite material, visible but not quite solid. The implication the text draws without stating it outright is this: the Watchers were not created here, they arrived here. And the place they arrived from has a name, a location and a color, and every night it rises in the east and hangs above the horizon, as it has for every generation of human history. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft photographed a region of Mars called Cydonia. Among the images was a formation about 2 miles long that, in that lighting and at that resolution, bore a striking resemblance to a human face. NASA dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow. But in the same region, independent researchers identified a grouping of hills and mesas arranged in geometric relationships that mathematical analysis suggested were non-random. Richard Hoagland, a former NASA consultant, published extensive analysis of the Cydonia formations in the 1980s, arguing the geometry was consistent with deliberate construction rather than natural erosion. Among the structures, researchers identified what they called a 5-sided pyramid, with internal angles matching precise geometric ratios. Natural erosion does not reliably produce 5-sided symmetry. NASA's position has remained that the formations are natural. Higher resolution imaging from Mars Global Surveyor in 1998 reduced, but did not eliminate, the apparent regularity. The images were released, the analysis was not funded, the conversation moved on, and in the final verses, the Red World passage describes what the first ones left behind: structures. The text calls them the marks of their dwelling, and describes them as made of stone cut to angles that do not appear in nature. It says these structures will outlast the judgment, because stone outlasts everything. It says they will be visible from above to anyone who knows to look, and that their arrangement encodes the record of what happened to the world that bore them. Cydonia, where the researchers found their geometry, sits in the northern lowlands of Mars. The passage places the dwellings of the first ones at the edge of the Great Tearing. The geography is approximate, but the relationship the text draws is deliberate, and it is the verse most thoroughly absent from Western translations of this section. The suppression followed the same path as every other buried section of Enoch. The Council of Laodicea removed the book from accepted scripture in 364. The cosmological passages, the ones dealing with other worlds, were singled out by the early church fathers as the most dangerous category of Enoch material. Jerome, around the year 400, called Enoch's descriptions of the heavens the imaginings of a man who looked up too often and thought too freely. Augustine argued that any text placing divine judgment on worlds other than Earth undermined the theology of human uniqueness and was therefore heretical by implication. Neither man engaged the Red World passage by name. Both built the framework under which it could be removed without discussion. And R.H. Charles, whose 1906 English translation remains the standard Western reference, published the Ethiopian Enoch but abbreviated the section corresponding to the Red World passage by a margin scholars estimate at over 300 words. The gap falls precisely on the verses describing the departure of the first ones and their connection to the later Watcher descent. Charles left no footnote, he made no acknowledgement, he moved on. In 2019, a researcher at the Hebrew University submitted a grant application to fund a comparative study of the cosmological passages in the Ethiopian Enoch and current planetary science on Mars. It was declined on the stated grounds of insufficient scholarly precedent for the comparison. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying that beings from Mars built the Cydonia structures and then descended to Earth and became the watchers of the Enoch tradition. I am not saying the text is a literal eyewitness account from a writer who somehow observed Mars from its surface. Ancient documents carry centuries of copying and interpretation, and the Ethiopic has passed through many hands across 2,000 years. But what the text describes, the red surface, the thin air, the water hidden in stone, the two fast moons, the judgment that stripped away the world's protection, the departure of survivors before the final collapse, matches what planetary science has confirmed about Mars with a precision that a writer in the 3rd century before Christ should not possess. Each element is independently verifiable, each element is accurate, and the convergence of all of them in a single ancient passage is not the kind of thing that happens by accident. I am Julian Crane. Mars is still there, rising in the east every night, red and silent, exactly where the text says to look. Cydonia is still there, its formations still photographed, still argued over, still officially unexamined by anyone with the authority to settle it. The Ethiopian manuscript is still in Axum, the Red World passage still inside it, in the same language it has always been in. And Phobos is still circling Mars in under 8 hours, rising in the west and setting in the east, moving the way a living thing moves, exactly as Enoch wrote. The judgment fell, the world was stripped of its shelter, the surface turned red. And what escaped before the end descended to a younger world, walked among its people, and left behind the chain of events that Enoch spent his life trying to record, and that the Church spent 16 centuries trying to bury. The red light in the sky is not a coincidence. It never was. So the next time it rises, look at it a little longer, and ask why a man who could not have seen it described it so exactly. I'll see you in the next one.